chat the people are doing. So, the comparison that I've been waiting the entire month for, the X200 Pro versus the Find X8 Pro. Both of these phones are the latest generation flagships from both companies, so it couldn't be a more apt or a more perfect comparison, now could it? But another thing that I'm really excited to finally test out is the fact that the X200 Pro doesn't really give us a 1-inch sensor anymore with the main cameras. And a lot of people have been bitching and moaning about that. Maybe it's for a good reason, maybe it's not. We'll find out in this comparison. But here's the thing. I feel most people are jumping the gun and just have prejudice because of a technical spec. Like at this point we should know that hardware is a tiny portion of the final image that you can have as an output from any of these smartphones. So it really makes no sense to have that kind of prejudice, now does it? But of course we'll find out, so let's jump in. So we are starting off with the color profiles as per usual, and yes, the X200 Pro has vivid colors which, as the name indicates, is going to give you a good amount of vibrance, but it's also going to give you slightly more brightened results. It may not be the case all the time, but at least in this case, it does look a little bit brighter than the other counterparts that we have. Now obviously, if you really hate brightened results, then you can actually go for the textured mode, which will not only give you slightly less brightness or exposure, it will also boost the contrast all the way to high heaven. Now, in certain instances where let's say you have really flat lighting, or it's just in general very bright and doesn't have a lot of innate contrast in the scene, it may work out. But especially in a situation like this where I'm taking this during sunset and there is a lot of, you could almost say, natural contrast present in the shot itself and in the way that it was framed, textured mode is not the best option. However, what I think is possibly one of the best natural color profiles and just one of the best color profiles in general is as natural colors on the X200 Pro. Now, on the X100 Ultra, the flagship that we had previously from Vivo, it didn't look as nice, to be completely honest. But in this case, and in the cases as you'll see soon enough, Vivo has improved on this. They have balanced out the exposure and contrast, they've fine-tuned it even more, and it looks better than ever before. So naturally you can choose whichever one you want, but I'm gonna stick with as natural colors because it is one of my all-time favorites. Now, let us address another elephant in the room, shall we? The fact that we don't get a 1-inch sensor. Here's the thing. It doesn't affect daylight photos, not by a long shot. If you take a main camera close-up, then you're gonna see some difference, especially in the depth of field. The Oppo is gonna provide more of that, but let's also face the fact. You're only seeing this minor difference between the two because it's a side-by-side camera comparison. Otherwise, normally, you won't even think about it. Because I'll tell you what's more important, consistency with the contrast, exposure, and dynamic range. And those are the things that the X200 Pro can sometimes not just keep up, but also excel at, as opposed to the Find X8 Pro, which, just for context, the Oppo has some of the best dynamic range and consistency that I've seen this year. Technically speaking, this is a next-gen flagship, so yeah, we don't have the next-gen flagships from the other stuff yet, but for the most part, in 2024 at least, the Oppo was one of the absolute best. And the fact that the X200 Pro cannot just keep up, but as you can probably tell, maybe even excel at it sometimes, it's quite something. And look, some amount of back and forth is always going to happen. No camera on this planet is perfect, and this goes for both of these two as well. Now, if you're wondering, the X200 Pro has actually had massive improvements with the main camera dynamic range as opposed to what we had with the X100 Ultra, because if you haven't checked out any of the comparisons I made for that phone, check one of them out, just any one of them is fine. You'll be genuinely surprised by just how much worse the highlight preservation used to be and how much better it's gotten here. Now obviously, if you're concerned about night mode with the main camera, given that it has a technically smaller sensor size on the X200, well then just hold on, we'll get to that as well. You might be surprised. But before that, we gotta deal with the ultra-wide cameras because, as you can probably tell, both of these phones have very similar tendencies like we saw with the main camera when it comes to handling, let's just say the exposure, the contrast, the balancing in general. But one thing I've noticed is that the Find X8 Pro, it does this with the main camera as well, but it has a tendency to boost the mid-tone details and basically the clarity. Sometimes that can look really processed, and I like to quote one of the comments that I read. It looks a lot like a smartphone photograph as opposed to, let's say, DSLR look that many people might prefer. It depends on taste, to be entirely honest, but with the ultra-wide camera, personally speaking, I kind of like the effect that it has. I'm not the biggest fan of how it looks as opposed to the X200 Pro, at least with the main camera, because the main camera by itself is very good at detail preservation as opposed to any ultra-wide camera. So in that regard, the Find X8 Pro, with the slightly higher detail boost that it gives us, is balanced plenty well, to the point that you will more often than not just get a nicer looking shot. However, when it comes to dynamic range, once again the X200 Pro by far pulls ahead, and it has some of the best dynamic range and highlight preservation that I've ever seen. It is genuinely stunning. I mean, just look at how well it's preserved, but also how nicely the fall off is being maintained. And then of course we have macro photography. Now here's the deal. Both of these phones can do telephoto macros, and that's honestly the way it should be. Because ultra-wide macros, they do not produce as nice looking images objectively. I'm not talking about a debate here, this is a bloody fact. I've seen far too many ultra-wide macros, and comparatively speaking, any and all even reasonably good telephoto macros would pull ahead. Even if you can't get as close to the subject as you might with certain ultra-wide macros, the look of the image, the depth of field, the lack of distortions, it just looks so much nicer, so much more professional when you use a telephoto macro. And on top of that, it is possibly some of the best that you can have on the X200 Pro, because this baby right here, it can utilize not just what is easily one of the, if not the highest quality telephoto camera in the history of smartphones. It can actually go for a sensor crop to give you basically a 7.4x zoom with macro capabilities. So I think you can imagine, right? It's gonna look stunning. And even though it's a sensor crop, you can't really tell. You only know about it because I'm telling you it's a sensor crop, because it's processed so well. And the fact that the telephoto camera is, once again, the highest quality that I've ever used, personally speaking, well, you're gonna get stunning results, as you can probably tell. Now, speaking of stunning results, we gotta check out zoom. You might be thinking, well, the X200 Pro has a technically lower quality sensor, a smaller sensor, as opposed to the Find X8 Pro, which I think it has a 1-inch sensor, if I'm not completely mistaken. At least I hope I'm not. Okay, so I just confirmed, and yeah, the Find X8 Pro doesn't have a 1-inch sensor. It is larger than the X200 Pro, that's why we were getting more depth of field, just so you know. But here's the thing. Larger sensor doesn't always mean better quality. So cropping all the way in with this 2x sensor crop, look, to be entirely honest, the Find X8 Pro doesn't have the best detail preservation, but this is what I'm talking about. Software is more than good enough to make up for these slight minor differences. And if you're wondering, yes, we will have a proper comparison against the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, which does have a 1-inch sensor, and we'll see there as well exactly how it performs. And then we have 3x or 3.7x on the X200 Pro, and I think we both know exactly how this is gonna go, right? And I guess the results speak for themselves. Now, obviously this was really during sunset, so I feel like the Oppo is the one that has the more natural colors. The X200 is kind of messing that up, but look, at the end of the day, the detail preservation with the 3.7x telephoto camera that we have, it's something else, to be entirely honest. Yes, there is some amount of artifacting on both phones, by the way. I don't know if you're able to see this on a smaller display on a smartphone or something like that after YouTube compresses everything, but there's definitely some artifacts along the edges, probably because of sharpening, but the overall details are so much better preserved on the X200 Pro. It's something else. But of course, the Oppo possesses hardware that it can take advantage of. A full-blown 6x periscope zoom capability. The X200 has nothing more than a 3.7x, but of course, the 3.7x is the best telephoto camera that I've ever used. So does that actually allow the X200 to keep up? Well, suffice to say, it doesn't keep up. No, it surpasses. Because even with a 6x telephoto zoom, imagine this for a second, we are not only cropping into 6x digitally from a 3.7x telephoto on the X200, we are also cropping in another 500% just to show off the details. And just take a look at those details. Is there processing? Yes, obviously there's going to be some amount of processing involved, but at the end of the day, it's this beautiful culmination of good hardware and stupendous processing. That's what's giving the X200 Pro the edge here. There's also the fact that the Find X8 Pro, in 12 megapixel images at least, the 6x doesn't really work all that well with detail preservation. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. In high res, however, I think things are going to end up slightly different than what you might normally expect. So with the main camera, immediately the difference between 12 megapixel and 15 megapixel shots are made obvious. So the Find X8 Pro, unlike the 2x sensor crop that we saw previously where we zoomed in and just the X200 Pro was miles ahead, well, with high res, it's actually very close on both. I think the colors are actually a little bit more accurate on the X200 Pro because those signs were basically reflecting the setting sun, which is why they look so bright and yellow. The Oppo is obviously balancing things out a lot more. Now with the ultra-wide camera, the Find X actually has really good detail preservation, only in high res though. With regular shots, the raw detail preservation and the natural sharpness is not particularly high, and that goes for every single sensor that we have here. It's a weird limitation. Now cropping into 500%, yes, the Oppo has a lot of details, and turns out so does the X200 Pro. Now comparatively, I do think the Find X8 Pro has slightly more sharpness in general, whilst the X200 looks a little bit softer. But the difference is minor, way less than what I had personally expected in this particular case. I thought the Oppo would pull ahead by a lot more. And then of course the telephoto cameras. Look, we all saw exactly what happened with the 12 megapixel telephotos, but will the Oppo with the high res actually do a little bit better? Well, let's find out. Now zooming in all the way, look, I think it's pretty obvious. The Oppo is just not gonna do as well as the X200 Pro. Even though I must say the difference between the two is much less as opposed to what we saw with the 12 pixel shots, because once again, the Oppo with 12 pixels does not preserve nearly as much detail as you would expect it to, as opposed to high res. Enough for 6x. Now, we all remember exactly how much of a train wreck the detail preservation was on the 12 pixel 6x zoom shots that we saw previously. But then with high res, things might be different. There's also the fact to consider that the X200 Pro has a 200 megapixel mode, which is exactly what we're using here. And well, as you can probably tell, the detail boost that the Oppo has with the high res is significant. It is the most obvious and significant when you're using the 6x periscope camera with high res. Now, I don't know why there's such a massive drawback in regular zoom shots and why the detail preservation is so much worse at 12 pixels, but the fact is this: if you want good detail preservation, you can have it with the high res, at least on the Oppo. On the X200 Pro, on the other hand, yeah, it's not as nicely and beautifully, perfectly detailed. There's a lot of processing happening for sure, because as opposed to just a 500% crop on the Find X, just a 500%. But yeah, this is around like a 770 to an 800% crop on the X200 Pro. So considering that, this is bloody good. There's no doubt about that. But what is absolutely not good on the X200 Pro, rather it is bloody atrocious, are the selfies. Because you see, up until now, with the main and the ultra-wide cameras, most of the shots were neck and neck. Yes, the dynamic range, for the most part at least, was better on the X200 Pro. The detail preservation was also better on the X200 Pro, for the most part, not in every single situation, but mostly. But when it comes to selfies, the Oppo, not only does it have a wider field of view, which directly plays to my taste because I'd rather have the camera be as far away from me as possible, to the point that I'm not even visible. That would be perfect because I don't like taking selfies. But it's just the fact that you're gonna get blown out highlights, you're gonna get weird low contrast sometimes, and the balancing does not work out on the X200 Pro. It's very unfortunate that it doesn't look nice. I don't know why such a massive drawback still exists on a phone of this caliber, but it absolutely does. And when it comes to selfie portraits, I'd say the differences are not as much, which again makes no sense because selfie portraits are supposed to be even more processing intensive and even more difficult to handle as opposed to regular selfies, which look decidedly worse. But yeah, that's just the case, you know. However, fortunately, thankfully, the X200 Pro's rear camera portraits are stunning. No doubt about that. Like, I took all of these shots in almost sunset conditions. Usually that can screw up the skin tones a lot, but I would say that for the most part, the X200 Pro was just a pinch better than the Find X8 Pro. Not every single time, of course, but most of the shots came out looking a little bit more appealing, a little bit nicer, a little bit less, I'd say, washed out with the skin tones particularly, as opposed to the Find X8 Pro. It's not the deal breaker difference when it comes to portraits, but what can be is the fact that the X200 Pro provides like 20 billion different options when it comes to customizing the way your portraits look. And that is not something the Find X8 Pro does. You also got to consider the fact that you don't even get a 35mm portrait option on the Find X8 Pro, which I don't really know why they don't include that, but you don't have it. The X200 Pro's 35mm is stunning and it is a fantastic choice to have. Now let's finally move on to night mode. So here's the deal. The Find X8 Pro has incredible night mode, especially with the main and the ultra-wide cameras. Its night mode capabilities are fantastic, very consistent, fairly natural looking, but also it maintains a good amount of brightness, it doesn't crush shadows. But then on the X200 Pro, there's a lot of concerns here because with the main cameras at least, you have a much smaller sensor, apparently. Is it gonna cause problems? Well, let me tell you right now, no. Absolutely not. Because, as you can probably tell, the images are beautiful, they are clean, they are stunning, without a doubt. Not a single shot came out looking like it was from an inferior sensor or an inferior camera as opposed to many of the other ones that I've used this year. A few of those had one-in sensors. There is definitively not an issue with the fact that we have a slightly smaller sensor. I really want to get that through everyone's heads because people are complaining about something that isn't a problem. If you want to complain about the selfie situation. But one thing that I have noticed is a massive improvement on the X200 Pro's processing department. It's the fact that we get really natural looking night skies now. Is it going to be perfect every single time? No, not quite yet. But more often than not, which was usually not the case before, the night skies and the general contrast, the nighttime look of the shot is maintained beautifully on the X200 Pro, which excites me a lot because that was one of my biggest complaints for almost 2 years. The last 2 years that I've used Vivo flagships has been one of my greatest complaints. One of my biggest issues that I've had is that the night mode turns out looking really tacky and unnatural and awkward. Not anymore, thankfully. And actually the highlight preservation and general balancing of the exposure is slightly better on the X200 Pro in certain instances as opposed to the Find X8 Pro. Sometimes I'm noticing a lot more blown out highlights on the Find X as opposed to the X200. So yeah, it's really good, the night mode situation. Complete opposite to what I was led to believe. And then with the ultra-wide camera, I think it's pretty much neck and neck because there's like minor differences in like saturation or maybe a little bit of contrast here and there, but it's so close that there's no point in saying that one of them is pulling ahead in certain instances or the opposite, vice versa in others. It just doesn't make sense. Both with the ultra-wide night mode, stunning, and they have really nice results. The X200 once again really tries to maintain that natural look, which honestly surprised me. I didn't really expect that to just be a sneaky little update that they've done here, but I couldn't be happier about it. Now, of course, when it comes to zoom at night, I think we know exactly what to expect at this point given the daylight results that we saw, but of course we got to check it out at least, right? And then with the 2x, in this particular case, I got to once again mention the highlight preservation on the X200 Pro, second to none. Really, like the Oppo is good, but the X200 Pros is better. But when it comes to the detail preservation side of things, I'd say both are very close. It's not as big of a difference as we might have expected, but it is still better on the X200 Pro, and couple that with the better highlight preservation, it definitely takes a lead. And now for 3x, see, the highlight preservation on the X200 is so spot on that honestly, even if it had less details, I would pick the X200 any day of the week. But the fact is, it doesn't. Actually, it has more detail as opposed to the Find X8 Pro. It's not a massive difference once again, but it really is the way the image is processed and presented to you. And the Find X, is it bad at night mode? No. But is it as good as the X200 comparatively? Also no. And I think this one right here, final nail in the coffin, 6x. And there's a good amount of light going on here, so the fact that we still have an absolute truckload of artifacting in the Oppo's night sky, that's disappointing, to say the least. It is disheartening. The fact that even with such a massive advantage in optical zoom, the X200 just in general is doing a better job. And even crazier is the fact that when you crop into 500%, the X200 is still doing a better job with detail preservation, even at night. That's how good it is at handling that telephoto camera. It really is something else. So with that said, we are at the end of this comparison. Here's the deal. If you had concerns or complaints about that main camera, I think we can rest assured at this point, right? Look, I've heard people say that we have a metric ton more noise as opposed to the X100 Ultra on the X200 Pro. That is not the case, decisively, not even in night mode. We were supposed to have about a ton more sharpening, I believe. Like it looked like an iPhone shot for some reason. At least that's what I heard in some of the comments. But yeah, that's also not the case. If anything, the Find X8 Pro does more sharpening and clarity boosting as opposed to the X200 Pro, which maintains a more natural look. At least in the daytime shots, that's how it looked, right? So yeah, I don't see a concern here. Is it ideal, the fact that Vivo has downgraded the sensor? No, obviously not. If we had the one-in sensor, no one would be complaining about it. There would be no problem at all. But to be completely honest, the software is beyond capable of handling this little downgrade that we have had in the hardware department. Is it a good thing that we have had a hardware downgrade? No, obviously not. But it's not worthy of our concern. What is worthy of our concern is the fact that the selfies suck balls. What is also worthy of our concern is that sometimes when we have HDR situations, the contrast might be a little too high or shadows might be a little too crushed. In some instances we saw that. So look, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to get at here is that the X200 Pro's, the problem that most people have is not really a problem at all. There are other issues that we should be concerned about, but not the main camera. Of course, I'll see you guys tomorrow with another comparison. Hopefully the next time will be the Xiaomi 14 Ultra's comparison, because that does have a 1-inch sensor. So let's see how it fares. Cheers.